Welcome to Innovator Café, the entrepreneur go-to, with your host, attorney Dave Stevens. Through each episode, Dave and his guests provide resources and assurances to build a company growth roadmap. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the website stevenslawgroup.com. Now here's the host of Innovator Café, Dave Stevens.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Innovator Café. Today, we are so lucky we have Tyler Finn on. And Tyler, I'm just going to let you talk about your background because I wouldn't even know where to start. It's so very interesting. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I've had a little bit of a varied and non-linear career, but thanks so much for having me, Dave. I really appreciate it. I've had a couple of friends who've been on the podcast and enjoyed their episodes. Adam Glick comes to mind. That's a great one. I feel lucky to be included in the company of folks like him and others.
You're very welcome to be here. Yeah.
My background, I started my career doing public policy for tech companies. I thought I was going to be sort of a DC person and go to DC. I ended up working on commercial drone policy and regulatory issues out of college. And then from there, I stumbled into privacy, which was becoming a much sort of hotter topic with GDPR going into effect in 2018, and then CCPA, and now all the state laws, and carved out a little bit of a niche for myself, working on privacy issues in the ad tech space, in particular, at a few different companies, doing a mix of compliance, managing our different data sources, acquiring third-party data, thinking about how our product roadmap and business strategy was going to need to evolve because of privacy pressures, right? Folks like Apple and Google, in addition to regulators, making a lot of changes around privacy. And then, like a lot of folks in the tech industry, I went through a layoff and started my own consulting firm doing some privacy work, and spent a lot of time working with the co-founders of TechGC, which is an amazing community for general counsels and now other lawyers and CFOs. And I think they've got plans to expand to CEOs as well sometime soon.
Right.
I worked with them on community issues, and ultimately that led me to SpotDraft and my current role. So my approach to community is making it up a little bit as I go, drawing on my background and relationships and knowledge of what GCs and other lawyers in-house really care about. And I feel really lucky to get to do it on a day-to-day basis and for it to be my full-time gig.
No kidding. It's funny going back to your early background. I mean, how interesting is it to go from drone type regulations, keeping drones from getting in the way of airplanes, to privacy, getting regulators in the way of people and free speech and all of that fun stuff. It's very personal. It's very sensitive, and it involves a high degree of trust. And you've got the company's trust in your hands. Talk more about that. I mean, trust, I think, is just such a major thing today, especially when you're talking to such high-level advisors, general counsels. Privacy. It really gets to the core of humanity, doesn't it?
It does. So, I mean, I'll go back to when I was working on drone issues. We liked to talk about it as the people who are in Manhattan, Kansas are probably going to have very different preferences around how drones deliver pizzas and medicines and other packages than people in Manhattan, New York, right? That 2 a.m. pizza delivery from Domino's is going to be pretty popular in New York City, a little less popular in Manhattan, Kansas. So as we thought about building a regulatory framework that we felt like would enable commercial drone operations for the long term, trust was really core to that effort, right? How are we going to build trust with all of these different communities and constituencies across the country and allow them to have some semblance of control over what was allowed to happen in the airspace near them? On privacy issues too, right? I mean, ultimately, we're talking about people's personal data, data that belongs to them. And
Sure.
So whether you're dealing with the press who is advocating for consumers, with regulators who are protecting consumers, or with the consumers themselves who are deciding whether or not they're going to share data with you or your partners, right? That's all about trust as well. So when I was thinking about, how we would approach privacy and our compliance programs and our products, of course we were considering, okay, what are our regulatory obligations and what are our customers asking us for, and where do we think the market is headed, and how do we make sure we're a part of this sort of broader pack of companies, right? Those are all important considerations, but moreover, we were thinking about how do we build a trusted business, a business with the right reputation for the
It's not
long.
just about compliance, is it?
Right. That's exactly right. It's not just about compliance. Checking the box will only get you so far. And if that's your approach, I hope that your business has some sort of exit strategy in 2 or 3 years,
Right.
because that's not building a sustainable business for the long run.
No. Well, people, there are trust issues with compliance in general, right? I mean, you just see these congressional hearings, if you ever watch these boring things, of people who have no idea what they're talking about, understanding, and they're making the laws. How could there be any trust? Oh, we comply with the statutes. Oh, really? I comply with the speeding rules too. It doesn't make me a good driver.
It's true. I mean, I do think there are a lot of folks in Washington, D.C. who are trying really hard. I also think that there's oftentimes a disconnect. And I honestly think that to a certain extent, that's on companies, right? I mean, if you're going to go out and build trusting relationships with whether it's the press or regulators or policymakers on the Hill or the European Commission, you have to be committed to education. And you have to recognize that the folks who've gotten elected to Congress probably have a different skill set than the product managers or marketing whizzes who you work with on a day-to-day basis. And so they might not immediately understand what's a lookalike audience. Let's say you might have to do some education and really invest in that relationship and recognize that there's going to be some initial skepticism, and that's okay. But if you actually approach that sort of education with sort of an open mind and are willing to listen to them and willing to try to invest in making sure that they at least understand your business model and the desires of the consumers that you're working with or the customers that you're working with, that maybe you'll start to push the needle in maybe a more moderate or in the right direction.
Well, right. And then what complicates that even more, it's politics. I mean, look, I started about politics. I don't think I'll ever do a talk about politics. But when you talk about education, you've got people competing with education, their own truths and their own, priorities, I would say.
Sure.
Right. So here you are, decision makers who are being lobbied, right? So lobbying is all about, right? And you want to tell a genuine story. How do you build trust with those decision makers?
I mean, I think part of it is telling the truth, right?
Sure.
So understanding, right? Understanding what let's take, data use as an example. Understanding really deeply, what do you actually do? What can you actually say? What is the truth, right? It's much better. I mean, when I counsel folks or when I've dealt with crisis comms situations before,
Sure.
it's much better to know what the truth is before that happens and then to tell it straight up, than to try to obfuscate and then realize that you have to correct the record later on. So that's one piece. I mean, another big piece though too is not doing it alone. So I've found a lot of success historically when you're talking to policymakers or talking to the press, right? Like, understand who else maybe has allied business interests with you, or at least if people have oppositional business interests, understand why that's the case, understand what their incentives are, know why they may be advocating for a position that's different than yours in public. And then like I said, not doing it alone. I've had a lot of success historically with working through industry associations, working together with other folks who are policy leaders or general counsels, et cetera, at other companies. I think that when you go at it, in concert, and it's a sort of push of allies, it's going to be a lot stronger, and it's also going to be a lot more credible than if you go at it alone.
Well, it's going to be very unique in DC too, because you talk about collaboration, trust and compromise. You don't hear much about that these days.
No, yeah.
And you learn more about really why are people against you, or why are they competing with you, why are they conflicting with you.
Mhm.
I would bet you've been surprised at how much commonality you had with them.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I mean, this is a great area where you can compromise. They
Mhm.
should not be invested in your failure necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that when you think about consumer protection, when you think about privacy, I think that actually there is a lot of room for common ground.
Mhm.
And while there may be political hiccups around something like, let's say, comprehensive privacy legislation,
Sure.
and I don't have a ton of confidence that it's going to happen in an election year. I do think that over the long run, there's more opportunity to meet in the middle on some of these issues than folks might recognize or might expect just at sort of a cursory glance.
Yeah, it is one of these unique issues where it really is ripe for agreement. This
I
kind of,
think so.
I mean, it's so interesting. Unless you're China or North Korea, right? I mean, seriously, and you could really learn from each other.
I agree. And I think that there's a lot more opportunity today than maybe there was 10 years ago or 15 years ago
Mhm.
for businesses to get behind something like privacy legislation as well. Uncertainty is never good for companies that are trying to grow, especially small companies that don't have or aren't able to afford armies of lawyers. Right. And I think also increasingly businesses recognize that they don't want to be, say, the arbiters of what they can and cannot do, or what all of the edge cases are around data use. Instead, they would actually rather have some sort of regulatory oversight, and they would rather be able to have real trust of consumers that someone is looking out for them. And I think there's, to a certain extent, there's been sort of a collapse of trust in consumers recognizing or thinking that businesses are always going to do right by them around how data is used. And so instead, if there was oversight from someone like the FTC, I think that would be welcomed by a lot of companies, and that they would join in and the sort of push for comprehensive privacy legislation.
Well, recent court cases it's going to continue to make it difficult for regulation of anything in government now,
Yeah,
right?
the Chevron case.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, I will say, and that's my disclaimer often. I'm certainly not a constitutional lawyer, but I think that you're right. I think most folks would read that as well, depending on maybe where you sit, a sort of handicapping, or a rightful reining in of the authority that a lot of agencies have. I mean, the response to that, probably from folks who think that there should be a sort of robust regulatory apparatus, is then you need legislation, right? Like Congress needs to legislate and restore or give that authority, grant that authority to agencies like the FTC or the EPA or HHS or whatever sort of sector you're in.
Well, sure, and and not to get into the to the legal morass of all of that, but the Reader's Digest version is that that the regulators in many different areas. We're talking government in general, right? It's not just privacy, right?
Sure.
They have been they've been perceived as overreaching. Whether it's land control, farming, or different things that they just get their hands into. They're built to regulate things, and they can be seen as over regulating because they reach and reach and reach until somebody slaps their hands, and that's what can happen, right? With privacy, I mean, look at I don't want to name these particular companies, but big social media companies. There is this expectation that that they have all the answers, and isn't that really well, it can lead to the collapse, right? Because Congress is like, look, we don't know your system, it's so complex, we hardly understand your technology, we can't tell an email from a text, to a post on Facebook, right? And tell us what you're doing, and we'll tell you that it's okay. Well, no, make the laws. So where do these laws come from? What is the next great step? Things have changed a great deal. People are immersed in social media.
Mm-hmm.
What is the next? This is a building block. This is, these are baby steps you have to take into progress.
I mean, I think my general view would be actually there are a lot of really good people who are well-intentioned, who are working at large social media companies, other large companies that have privacy issues, that are actually looking out for the interests of the consumer, or are trying to make sure that edge cases that may earn the business a few dollars here or there today, but create problems long term, or actually really harm people in some cases, by the way, right? Make sure that those things don't happen. I think that is the case. But I think, to your point, crafting legislation that can deal with all of those small individual issues or use cases is challenging. And so my view is that instead what you need is sort of broader legislation that empowers a regulator to look at this, right? To start to craft black and white rules of the road, or say certain use cases are off limits. I think, a one that's particularly salient right now, and that you'll hear a lot of consensus around generally, is like, in the advertising space, people should not be advertising based on inferences that folks have been to, say, like an abortion clinic, right? That's like a very sort of bright line use case that I think that a lot of us agree that someone like the FTC should mark as off limits, but they need the authority to do so. And then I think the other piece here too, and I'm not an expert on this area of the law myself, but is, if you're going to have a more prescriptive regulatory environment around data use and around privacy, because of the need to comply with that and to work with regulators, oftentimes there are maybe adverse competitive effects in the market. I mean, this is what you saw in Europe. And so you need to actually couple, right, privacy regulation with a sort of robust antitrust or competition enforcement regime, because the conclusion here probably shouldn't be only a few big players are allowed to exist because they're able to hire armies and armies of lawyers and work very, very closely with the regulators. But likewise, you shouldn't allow there to be a sort of like race to the bottom in the market in which small players are getting off because regulators don't have the resources or time or ability to uncover their practices, sometimes which, like I said, create real harm. So I think that sort of mix of giving regulators more authority to make more prescriptive rules around what is and what isn't off limits around use cases on data use, coupled with antitrust enforcement or competition enforcement. In my view, that's the sort of longer run answer.
Sure.
I think that there is actually some political will around both of those things right now, around both, right, like privacy and antitrust together. As you've pointed out, I think there's actually an interesting sort of meeting in the middle on the political spectrum there. But whether or not it happens, we'll have to see.
To an earlier point you made too, it doesn't always solve problems by making examples beating up the big guys.
Sure.
Right? It doesn't really solve the problems, right? Because often the bad players, especially if they're truly indifferent or even mean-spirited, they're going to get done what they feel like they want to get done. And also, foreign players
Sure.
who are we're practically we're in cyber wars, right? And tasking these big companies to try to fight them off may be a little bit too much to ask, because money and resources don't always make these go away.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've certainly seen well, I'm not gonna bring any companies up, but like I've certainly seen here and there a few businesses that I think are predicated on the idea of we can make a good amount of money doing things that other people in the market are unwilling to do because they want to build more sustainable, longer run businesses. We think we can skirt beneath the small amount of bad press that we may get, and we're going to sort of skirt under the view of the regulators. And then we know that we are either going to be regulated out of existence, or will be acquired, or something will happen in 3 to 5 years, but that's okay because we will have sort of, it's an extractive business model. And I think that that's the sort of thing that you can't expect the Facebooks, the Googles, et cetera, of the world to fully police. That's a place where regulators, I think, really need to step up and step in.
Right. All those conflicting interests, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even the most well-meaning companies, you've got giant bureaucracies in them also, right?
Sure.
And it just happens, and you got people in groups in different locations and just not even talking to each other. They have their own goals, and not even even understanding where the conflicts are. They can arise just out of the nature of the day-to-day business, intentional or otherwise. Right?
Definitely. I've never worked at a huge company, but I've been lucky to know a lot of people who have, and have told me stories. And I think that large companies often run a lot like a bunch of little small companies than people might expect from the outside, right? Whether you're at 20-person business, or a 50-person business, or a 500-person business, or a 5,000-person business. You get bigger, you may have more resources. It doesn't mean that things are always quite as efficient or buttoned up, or that all the coordination problems that you might expect are solved.
No kidding. It's funny, Hewlett Packard is a good example of a company that actually embraced that. And if you actually looked inside that company, what you see are hundreds of small companies. They even have their separate CEOs, CFOs, and they operate like a community of startup companies. And there is this I won't call it a demagogue, but it runs things. It's an operation, but they've kind of accepted the fact that we're not just going to keep breaking up this company. We're going to make everybody cooperate and compete internally in their own way, right? And they accept that, and it's almost like its own little economy.
That's interesting.
But I've worked with very large companies where I swear I go in there, and I've never worked for a big company like this.
Sure. And
you just look around, and there is bizarre behavior around you. It's because they're focused on their goals, and they can be completely obtuse to reality, or even the benefit of the company, right? because you start slicing and dicing up all these activities and goals, you can't even trace where things are going often.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm usually in your chair. I think, as you know, I have a podcast where I interview a lot of folks, legal leaders, people who used to be legal leaders and now are doing other things otherwise. If I were going to ask you a question, it would be, because I know that your focus is very deeply on IP law and helping enable innovation in businesses. What have you seen that works really well for that? Like, who are the clients who you're like, wow, like these folks have a really strong IP strategy, whether it's in-house or via acquisition, or like what do you think works well there?
Well, I think back to a point you made earlier, if there's strong trust culture, it makes all the difference. It makes all the difference. They're not trying to snipe each other, outdo each other, try to grow their budgets bigger than others, right? Like, we're filing patents. Here's the purpose. Here's the purpose behind it. So every single thing you invest in, if it doesn't meet this purpose, it's not going to get done.
Right.
Right. And it really, I'll name a couple of companies in the positive. Intel is an excellent company like that. Right.
Yeah.
I visited, a guy I was working with, CEO came by and sat down and had lunch with us. He didn't know me from Adam. And it's one of these places where, well, their lunch place is just not a place of hierarchy. It's a place where people just eat and talk and do things, right? And there's no hierarchy. When it comes to doing business, the focus is really on doing the right thing, and you see it all over the place. And it's in the culture, from leadership on down. When the culture is, I mean, you say it's toxic, but if the culture is not trusting, then you end up with lots of battles in between. I mean, I've seen large companies, huge companies, where there are the people driving the ship, there are people that are actually, interfacing with customers. Then in between, there's always political battles. That's where a lot of energy and resources go, and that's where all this obtuse kind of internal regulation comes out. Right.
I mean, I love this theme around trust, and I'm glad that it's something that we focused in on for our conversation, because I think about that all the time today when I think about community work, right? So like I often get asked, okay, so you do community, is that marketing or is that sales or is that, and it's like, to a certain extent, it's all of these things, right?
Sure.
I mean, like, it is events, it is content, it is working closely with our marketing team, it is being in market and ultimately, right, over the long run, driving revenue. If you can't be producing in some way, or you can't be demonstrating that the whole business is growing, jobs like mine aren't going to exist, because you're going to start to boil down to, hey, we need these engineers and this product manager and these few sales reps, and that's about it.
Right.
But I think that it really is ultimately about trust, right? In that engineers are incentivized to ship a lot of code. Product managers are incentivized to design new features. Marketers are incentivized to track certain metrics, right? And demonstrate that they're bringing qualified leads into the business. AEs are incentivized to close those leads and turn them into revenue. Community is supposed to sit there and think about, as we do these different things, right? As we launch new products, as we send out messaging and host events, as we reach out to folks and try to do demos with them and ultimately convert those leads into sales, are we doing so in a way that we think is going to build the business in the right way for the long run? Are we really building trust with and real relationships with the people who we think could be our customers tomorrow or the day after that, or next year, or even a few years down the road, when they're in a second or third different job from the one that they're in now, right? That's what we're thinking about. We're thinking about, how do we build trust for the long run? And I think that whether it's, working with consumers or the press or regulators or internal stakeholders like you're talking about, or customers, right? Like, I think that trust is really animating all of those conversations. And with so much more information out there, it's a lot more important today than it might have been 20 or 30 years ago.
No doubt. No doubt. And it can be used in a very positive way. It could also be weaponized, right? But
Sure.
but trust, yeah. And and I think what you're saying too, internally, it really has to come from within. Of course, each person, we can really get all zen here, but the company, right? There has to be a culture of trust.
It does. The company does have to care about it. And I think that there are also times when, and this requires leadership on the part of the CEO, other members of the exec team, the CRO, to say, no, we're not going to do that deal. Or to say, hey, we need to cool it on the way that we're reaching out to people and like tone it down a little bit, right? Or the CMO to say, yeah, like, this is going to kind of hurt to tell the truth in this way today, but we think that it's going to be the right thing to do over the long run. I think as you think about building trusting relationships with all of these sort of different external stakeholders, right? You operate in a pretty complicated environment with a lot of intelligent, right? I remind people of this all the time. Like, our customers are very smart. Think of them as really smart. And other external stakeholders too, who are really well educated and smart and might have like a really interesting different perspective on your business or how you operate. Thinking about how those relationships play out over the long run is super important. Like, and sometimes it means that there's going to be a little bit of short-term pain, whether it's in terms of, right, like a little bit of bad press or revenue that's slightly lower because you said we're not going to do that deal, or whatever it is. Having leadership that's able to take a long-term view, I think, is so crucial to this.
Well, talk. I totally agree with you. Talk a little bit about internal communication as well, because this is what people look at, even in everyday life and personal relationships and things. People like to look away and not get into conversations, whether going to the Little League baseball field or spending time in other social places. Companies are no different. It's social inside. You're working next to human beings there, right?
Yeah. I mean, I've got a bunch of views on how you build trust internally. Some of which are a little bit more structured, some of which are not. I mean, I guess like we'll start with maybe the not so structured side of it, and that's that. I've worked for now pretty much since the pandemic a bunch of different remote businesses, or I've been remote, and I think that there is a propensity there when everyone's remote to view your day to day very tactically. And to view your relationship with the business somewhat instrumentally, right? Like, okay, you pay me and I do this work. And so small things, right? Like for the first 5 minutes of this team call or the first 15 minutes of my conversation with my direct report or whatever it is, not talking about work and not getting through the agenda of to-dos or tasks that you need feedback on, I think is super important. Bringing
It's transactional.
it makes it less transactional. Yes, that's the right word. Exactly. Bringing individual teams together like quarterly or at least twice a year, bringing, if you can afford it, a whole company together. If the company is quasi-remote or fully remote, at least once a year, I think is really important. So you can develop those sort of personal relationships with your colleagues and not just see them as, oh yeah, that's the guy who does the marketing analytics stuff over there. Right.
Right. It's Bill from accounting.
Exactly. So, I mean, I think that's one piece of building a trusting culture, especially in the sort of remote environment that so many of us operate in. As you think about, and this is something I've thought a lot about, as businesses deal with thorny issues or political issues, things that might result not unreasonably in some pretty serious disagreement internally about what path the company should take, or should the company speak out on this or that? Should the company do this deal with that other business or company, right? Might be controversial for whatever reason, right? Maybe you're trying to do a deal with Huawei or something, right? Like that's bound to be controversial within your company. I think that having strong process established around how you make these types of decisions, whether it's, are we going to do this deal? Do we have a formal deal desk process? Right? Are we going to evaluate this deal just like we evaluate all the other deals? And then our exec team will make a decision and we will agree as a community or as a company, right, to commit to following that, right? Whether it's, are we going to launch this new product feature that uses this type of data in a new way where there might be some reasonable disagreement about what the risks are associated with that, especially today around AI, right? Having process is super important. Maybe it's just a comms thing, right? Maybe it's, is the company going to speak out on this sort of hot button political issue that we feel like our consumers might care about? There might be some people in the business who say we shouldn't speak out on anything, right? But if you have a process for evaluating whether or not your company is going to take a position on something that may be seen as political, right? I think it's going to be a lot easier to make that decision in a trusting way, and in a way in which people within the business feel like they've at least been heard, even if they might not agree with doing that deal or launching that product feature or speaking out on this issue, right? Even if they might not agree with the end result, at least they feel like the right process was run, sort of different views were heard, and ultimately the CEO or some other member of the exec team made a call and everyone is committed to following that decision. I think process is super important for trust there.
Right. So what I'm hearing in that process too, and what correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm missing something, but it's, open communication, it's, genuine decision-making and feedback.
Yes.
It doesn't go into this dark room where the decision comes out and why did they do that? Right. And especially when there's hot button, there's emotions internally too. Right? You're working with human beings. There's emotions in there, right?
That's right.
Beings, when people, especially when people they feel slighted or they're a little emotional, whatever those emotions are, right? you address those by letting them talk and
Absolutely.
listening to, right? Yeah.
Yes. I think that, I mean, I've gotten very good at it through my podcast and through moderating panels. And
Sure. Sure.
I think that listening is an underrated art form, and then
Yeah.
learning how to how to how to probe a little bit, right? And I mean, we don't all have to be armchair psychologists. That's not
No.
right. But
Something's sitting wrong with somebody if you're paying
yeah,
attention.
yeah,
Right.
paying attention. Why is that the case? I mean, part of the act is just listening to them, but part of it is trying to uncover like what's driving that. Yeah.
Right. Right. I tell you, I'll be honest. I walked away from these podcasts from people like you. I walk out. I'm like, yeah, I got to really practice. You need these reminders. I hope everybody listening here actually heard that, right, and realize
Yep.
that sometimes you'll get focused, malfocused, whatever it is. You're focused on something, and you forget about that person in the corner who cares about you, and you care about,
Yes.
right? And it
I
matters.
will I will say personally, and I'm sure that there are a lot of other people listening to this who are like me. I'm a very solution oriented person and sort of solution oriented manager or leader, right, within a business.
Sure.
And both in my personal life and in my professional life, I have
Yeah.
to remind myself sometimes that the most important thing I can do right now is sort of shut up and sit here and listen and be empathetic, as opposed to trying to identify like what might seem to me like an immediate solve for the problem that someone is presenting to me. Because maybe, only a quarter of the reason that they're bringing this to me is because they want a solution. The other 3/4 is they just want someone to listen to them and hear them out, and
Right.
do so with a sense of empathy.
Or there's something completely different that's bothering them. My wife taught me
Yes.
that. This is what marriage taught me. I will tell you that, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to fix this thing, right?
Right.
But what you don't understand is really what the underlying problem is.
Right.
And often I find, well, so when we're unpacking intellectual property, the best intellectual property comes from when you define the problem statement really well.
Mhm.
And inventions and innovation, these are the solutions to those things.
Sure.
Turn it over to privacy, personal relationships internal to the company. Lay out the problem statement. What is that? And it's very hard to unpack for people because they're like, it's a personal thing. I'm just going to go back to accounting and do my job.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's one of the things that I think it's one of the steepest learning curves of management, right?
That's well,
Right? Yeah, allocating projects or people's time or thinking about budget, or even to a certain extent identifying, okay, this is where we are today. This is the strategy or the roadmap that is going to
yep.
get us to where we need to be in 2 quarters, or by this time next year, or to the next funding round. Or that, I think, is actually sort of all the easy stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, once you put it into practice and you're rewarded by it, and you are, delivering rewards to other people, recognition, big
Mm-hmm.
thing in a company, right? Then
Mm-hmm.
you start to see these things work.
Yes. This is just very tactical, but I mean, I've seen businesses, a bunch of businesses use different internal engagement tools, whether it's on Slack or otherwise,
Sure.
recognizing people for the hard work that they've done.
Right.
Sometimes it involves, right, like you get these points, you can go and get an Amazon gift card, right, or a Starbucks gift card.
Right.
But I think that it's that recognition in front of all of their peers that is most important. And I mean, I don't know what the best tool is for that. I'm not on the HR team who evaluates that sort of thing. But if your
Right.
business doesn't have one of those, and you do spend a lot of time operating in Slack, or you do have weekly or bi-weekly all hands meetings, and you haven't thought about how recognition should feature in to your the sort of like day-to-day of your business, I would go out and get one of those apps or tools. I think they're fantastic for that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not just cash. It's
It's
not, of
not just
course,
cash. No, that's
boys will love that. But that gets very expensive when you start leveling up, right?
yeah. It's not just cash. Yeah, it's the recognition in front of their in front of their peers and by their peers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
and
had a client that would, the CEO would have an all hands once a month, and for the awards for submitting patent applications and things, right? Because you get a cash reward, you get this plaque, whatever it is. He would personally deliver it to a person, like in front of the whole group.
Yeah.
And it would do a couple things. One, it would bring them close to him. He's the leader, and he's compassionate, right? And it would also take these quiet people in the corner who, look at their shoes when they're talking to you, bring them out and say, "You're awesome."
Yeah.
Your boss probably didn't tell you this today, but look at this. It's interesting about like intellectual property is that, it's certified proof. It's the only thing. Certified proof you've done something that no one has ever done before. It's certified by the government.
Yeah.
Right? They do a cert to validate this, right? And here you did this awesome thing and no one's ever done this before. Oh my God. This is like, what a management tool, right?
Right.
And there's opportunities every month, for most companies, sometimes even every day, to recognize people for something that's truly unique.
And there's part of that also that in your example that is culture building, right? Which is if management recognizes and rewards and does so in a sort of timely, formal fashion, people who come up with things that are patentable, there's going to be huge incentive internally to generate new ideas for things that are patentable. I'll give you an example from, when I was sort of early on doing privacy compliance work. I entered a business where, let's say, the product team, the sales team, certainly to a little bit lesser extent, the marketing teams were skeptical of what I was going to do and whether or not I was going to say no to a lot of the great ideas they had for growing our business. And it took 6 months, 9 months, demonstrating, right, that I was not the department of no, that I was going to work collaboratively with them, that I was going to be very sort of solution oriented, that I was not totally completely risk averse.
And watching and judging. Right.
And to your point about recognition, and how important that can be, right? I think there were probably still some folks, even 9 months in, on the sales team, let's say, who were a little bit skeptical of me. Like they were starting to come around, but they were a little bit skeptical of me. And I remember I sent out an email, like all company email, announcing a new policy or something to that effect. And our chief revenue officer, who is a fantastic leader, now the CEO of another company, but a very sort of serious Brit, right? Like likes to go on 100-mile bike rides and is super trim and fit and kind of a serious British guy. He responds to that email, which does not very often do on all company-wide emails. He says, like, this is very important work. Everyone should pay attention to this. Regards, Rob. And I felt like that was such a huge unlock, right? One, for credibility with his team and all those other folks in the business who might have been skeptical. And two, talk about culture building, right? Like I could sit up there all day at every company all hands meeting and say, compliance is important to our culture. We care about privacy. We want to do the right thing, right? But just a message like that from someone in leadership, right, goes a long ways towards sending the signal to the business that, okay, it's not just compliance, it's not just that department, it's not just the sympathetic execs, it's also our CRO who really cares about our bottom line, who also cares about having a culture of compliance at this business.
And in that leadership position, he didn't even have to explain why.
Yeah.
You spent 9 months, pouring out the why, trying to convince them. And you have to.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're not the guy in charge.
Right. That's right. I hadn't thought about it quite like that before. That's right. All he had to say was, everyone pay attention to this. And that was enough.
They already trust him. He transferred the trust is really what he did. Right. He smiled on you and he said, this is important. Right. And that's really incredible. And if they do that tactically, and from what I'm hearing, not very often, it has so much more weight.
That's true. I think that was also part of the key, right? And that's not necessarily the lesson here that I want to impart on folks, is not necessarily be sparing in your praise.
That's right.
But I think that in that particular circumstance, the fact that he was generally sparing in his praise made his message resonate all the more.
Right. That's right. Well, okay. So let's talk about, praise, and it's not necessarily that you do it seldom, that it makes it so rare and valuable, but that back to what you said earlier, it has to be genuine.
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, my mother always thought that was awesome. I couldn't do wrong. Right. So when she said everything was okay when I struck out a baseball, I was like, no, it's not. And you saying so doesn't make it better. Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think you need to recognize praise for effort is different than praise for accomplishment. And you want, your team members and you want folks internally to be very focused on effort as opposed to accomplishment. And when things go wrong or when we fail, right, like that's okay too. But it's right. If let's go back to the engagement tool. If you're giving, your peer or you're giving the person, your direct report, praise for every single project that they finish in the engagement tool, it's probably not going to resonate as much as if it's when they do something truly extraordinary. Yeah.
Sure. It's, you would probably be a really good little league baseball coach. Because that's what coaching is all about. These little kids, and you're forming this, right? I swear, if you would just go spend a day at a baseball game or even a practice, right? You'd look at this and say, "This is what we do inside companies. What we need to do." Right?
Yeah. I've never played baseball.
You never played baseball?
I know. I coached tennis when I was younger, and that was an exercise in patience when you're dealing with 5-year-olds who want to use their rackets as swords. But but you're right. I mean, coaching a team, yeah. I read a lot of books on sports and performance and how athletes perform more and how teams work together. And I mean, I think there's a ton of lessons that you can draw from how a great sports team works together, or how a great individual athlete performs at a super high level and trains at a high level and doesn't burn out. And there's all sorts of lessons you can draw from that you can apply to sort of the day-to-day of your business.
There's a nonprofit called Positive Coaching Alliance.
Cool.
And it's very underfunded, but very, very big. I mean, like any nonprofit, especially in little kids sports. Go Breeze, and listeners, go check out that website. It's not shiny and fancy. There is content in there. You'll look at that and say, "Oh my God, they're right." Right? I mean, it's just, and it really is very inspirational, influential, and I swear it follows many of the threads you've been talking about right here.
Do you coach Little League baseball?
I have.
Yeah.
I have, and I wrote a book about coaching it and all the parents that I had, and that's another subject. But I will tell you that the whole world, the best baseball teams are the ones where the coaches and the parents agree on positive coaching. Mm-hmm. And everything that you've been talking about, there really is nothing different, right? Mm-hmm. Incentives, rewarding effort, not rewarding win-win-win, because they will do anything to win if you do that. And that's true with adults too. And their goals.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's culture, right? Yeah. Even little league teams, I'm sure, have a culture, and it comes from the top down. I think one of the things, I mean, my career has not been that long, but I've worked for a variety of reasons for a whole host of different CEOs or with different CEOs in advisory capacities. And I am a much stronger believer today than perhaps I used to be, that culture is often a top-down exercise, and that it's super important to set the right culture when you are a CEO. That's maybe along with like keeping the lights on because there's money in the bank and recruiting the right talent. That is among the most important roles that you have when you're leading an organization.
No doubt. I was told once that you're never going to manage your way to success. You're going to hire your way to success.
I think that's right. I mean, yeah, I think hiring is oftentimes one of the hardest things that managers or leaders have to do, right? Like finding the right people, attracting the right talent,
Yeah.
finding someone who's a great fit, whose interests and excitement aligns exactly where your org or your business is at that given moment in time.
Right.
But I think to your point, it's probably one of the most important things you can do. You get to a point where you can only have so many good ideas, right? And instead, you need a lot of other people to have great ideas too, and you need them to also want to run at the same goal or target as you and execute on them.
No doubt, no doubt. Tyler, this has been a really enjoyable talk, I will tell you, right? And I'm hearing from my producer in the background too. She's loving it.
Excellent.
Lots of great ideas, and she's seen all of mine, right? But let's have some closing comments if you can. This is Innovator Cafe. You've talked a lot about innovation in business and people.
Yeah.
How about some words for budding entrepreneurs?
Sure. That's a great question. I guess, I mean, I think that as I talk to more folks who are founders, and as I've gotten to work with some here and there, decided to go and start their own business, whether it's a community business or a tech product or it's content that they're creating, whatever it is. Oftentimes they certainly have an insight, they're certainly filling a void. But I think that they recognize that like they've got to figure it out on a day-to-day basis, that they don't have all the answers immediately, that they don't necessarily know exactly where it's going to lead, and having the sort of determination and persistence to push through tough times, to sort of lean in when someone is a power user or when an event goes really, really well, and to sort of draw on that sort of great experience and strength. My experience is the sort of like best innovators, the best entrepreneurs, the best founders who I'd had the opportunity to work with are people who recognize that they don't have all the answers immediately. They've got some sort of core insight that's motivating them, and then they're willing to sort of give it their all as they figure it out, and bring, as we've talked about, bring people on board who want to sort of join the journey with them. And yeah, those are really cool people to work with, whether you're able to do so full-time in an advisory capacity, whether you're able to invest in them, maybe it's just supporting them here or there, right? And sending them a lead or two, or giving them kudos on LinkedIn or whatever it is. They're really cool people to work with. And I'm lucky to have had the opportunity to do so.
Yeah. Even the guys on top, the people, the men and women on top, don't always get the recognition, right? Because there's nobody on top giving the recognition down, right?
Totally.
Right. In a community, everybody gives everyone recognition. Tyler, great advice. Great advice. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for being on Innovator Cafe.
Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Great. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
You've been tuning into Innovator Cafe, the entrepreneur go-to, with your host, attorney Dave Stevens. You can find more episodes on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the website, StevensLawGroup.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.